So before we dive in, just a quick word on who I am and why I'm speaking with you today. So I actually started my career at Juilliard studying bassoon performance. And if you're wondering how someone goes from a music conservatory in New York to managing grid integration projects in California, it's honestly a great story. And maybe we'll get into it over drinks sometime. But short version is this industry found me, and I never looked back. So I've spent the last 7 years performing project management across 3 pretty different corners of this industry. I started at an empirical focused on transmission and distribution engineering projects, and then moved into SCADA integration work with NorCal Controls. And then for the last couple of years, I've been serving as GridSME's Director of Grid Integration Operations, which does include managing the KISO new resource implementation process for developers, which is as complex a PM environment as you're probably going to find. I also hold my PMP certification, and I'm an active member of the PMI Sacramento Valley chapter. So what I'm sharing today is grounded in both real field experience and the formal frameworks we'll be talking about. All right. And as mentioned too by Vivian, as we're going here, if you have a question, feel free to use the chat throughout. Drop it in, and I'll either address it in the moment, or as mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So here's how we're going to spend our time today. We'll start with why project management actually matters in this industry and in general, because it is worth grounding in conversation there before we get into some of the core frameworks. From there, we'll walk through the core principles from the PMBOK, or the Project Management Book of Knowledge, which is the foundational standard that the PMP certifications and all other PMI credentials are built on. And then we'll get into the parts that don't always make it into the textbook. So some of the gray areas, the tools that actually work in practice, and some of the common pitfalls that separate good PMs from really great PMs. And then we'll close with some key takeaways, and again, open it up for Q&A. So first, why does project management actually matter? Well, we work in an industry where projects are technical, they're heavily regulated, they involve a lot of moving parts and stakeholders. And so project management is not an administrative layer on top of the real work. It is the work. And here's the way I think about it. The PMBOK, or the Project Management Book of Knowledge, that gives us the science of project management. Again, the frameworks, the processes, the terminology, that's what all the certifications are going to test you on. And all of that is genuinely valuable. But as we all know, real life demands the art. That's knowing when to push a stakeholder and when to give them space. That's knowing when a schedule is recoverable and you need to reset expectations. That judgment isn't going to be in any textbook. So again, today's goal is to give you both of those, the science as a foundation and enough of the art that you can actually use it on your projects starting as soon as possible. So let's start with the foundation here. The PMBOK defines a project as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. And the key word there is temporary. So again, meaning it has a defined start and defined end. And I think that distinction matters quite a bit. So to execute any project successfully, PMI breaks project management into the 5 process groups you see here. You can think of these as phases every project is going to move through, regardless of size or complexity or length of time. So the first one in blue here is initiation. This is where you're going to define the what and the why of your project. You're doing things like establishing feasibility, you're getting stakeholder buy-in, and you're formally authorizing the project to exist. Again, in our world, in my work, I think of this as the moment a developer signs an interconnection agreement and the clock starts on their time frame to move that project forward. The next phase is planning. So this is where most of the real PM work is going to happen, and also where I feel like most teams underinvest. You're building the roadmap, your scope, your schedule, your budget, your risk, your communication plan, and the quality of your planning a lot of the time directly determines the quality of your execution. The next one in green is execution. So in this phase, you're doing the actual work. You're coordinating with your team, you're managing your resources, you're communicating regularly with all your stakeholders, and you're maintaining quality while you're doing all of that. So this is really the phase where that plan meets reality. Next, in orange, you're monitoring and controlling. So this is going to run parallel to execution the entire time. In the context of the visual, it should really be layered kind of adjacent to execution, but this is where you're tracking progress against a baseline you might have, identifying deviations in scope, managing things like scope creep, which we'll talk about more. And you're mitigating any risks that pop up on the project in real time as they appear. And then finally, closure. So when the work is done, when the project is done, you're formally closing it. You're doing things like confirming final deliverable acceptance, capturing lessons learned across the project and at the close of the project, and completing any final sign-offs. So these 5 groups are really the skeleton of every project, and everything else we talked today lives inside one of these phases. So in addition to the 5 process groups, the PMBOK also defines 10 different knowledge areas. And these are really the core disciplines a project manager has to actively manage across the entire project lifecycle. I'm not going to go deep on every single one of these today, but I do want you to see the full picture here. So the 10 in order here are scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, communication, risk, procurement, stakeholders, and integration. It's a lot to think about, a lot to juggle, but I want to focus for a minute on scope, schedule, and cost. I think those are the ones most people think of when they think of project management. You may be familiar with the term triple constraint or even iron triangle, but if you're not, that's basically a model that says, if you increase scope, you typically need to increase your cost and time. Or conversely, if you're shortening your schedule or your time, you usually need to reduce the scope or increase the budget to maintain quality. And so those 3 knowledge areas in particular are sometimes at odds with each other, or very closely related in terms of impacts to one impact another. But obviously a great PM is also actively managing things like risk, stakeholders, communications, quality, right? All of these other knowledge areas. And I think a lot of those are actually where we often see projects get more off track. But two others for today that I wanted to highlight specifically for our industry and our work are stakeholder management first. So in our work, we're constantly navigating different utilities, developers, regulators, and internal teams, all with different and competing priorities. And the other one is integration, which really through all of this is kind of the PM's meta job or umbrella job, which is making sure that all of these areas are working together and in tandem rather than individual silos. So keep these 10 areas in the back of your mind as we move through the rest of today. You'll start to see how everything connects back to one of these uniquely. All right, let's get into the science. And first, what I would say, something that I've noticed in my 7 years in this industry so far is that a lot of project failures or hiccups aren't necessarily caused by teams that didn't know some of these scientific tools, science tools. I see things caused by teams that knew the tools were there, knew what they were, but decided not to lean into them fully or skip them entirely. Something like a work breakdown structure, which we'll get into a minute here. That can feel like an overhead activity or back office administrative work until the moment your schedule falls apart and no one on the project can explain why. Something like defining scope in a document written down. That can feel bureaucratic or like red tape until a client asks for something that wasn't in agreement. So these aren't meant to be theoretical exercises. They're really meant to be insurance policies for your project that protect you as the PM and all the stakeholders involved. So what does putting the science into practice actually look like? Again, first tool that we'll cover today is the work breakdown structure, the WBS. This is going to be how you take a complex project and decompose it into manageable pieces. So again, for something like a construction schedule or even a software implementation project with dozens of different work streams, hundreds of tasks, multiple resources, something like this is non-negotiable. But in NRI work or maybe some other projects, right, like a WBS might be a little bit leaner than a construction schedule, but the discipline of being able to map it out before you build your actual schedule or your timeline is the same. And then secondly here, defining scope clearly upfront to prevent scope creep. So simple analogy here is if you're a construction PM building a home, you're scoped to have 3 rooms in that home. Client wants to keep adding rooms, or even a software PM where the client is requesting new features mid-build multiple times. Without a clearly defined and agreed scope boundary, your schedule and your budget really don't mean anything, right? So again, in our world, this can show up too as something like major milestones on a project getting pushed or expanded without the corresponding timeline adjustment in terms of the work needed to get there. Then the third one here from a science perspective, tracking, reporting, and controlling performance. So things like KPIs and business intelligence are, again, not just overhead. They're how you can communicate the health of a project to stakeholders and catch problems before they become major crises. Questions like, are we consistently losing time in a particular phase of a project? Is a resource chronically over allocated? That data is going to tell you where to look and also give you some of the ammunition to escalate those items appropriately when you need to. And then here's where we get into the art. So the stuff the PMBOK might imply, but doesn't explicitly tell you or teach you. What does a great PM actually do, right? First one, they translate. A great PM is a communication bridge at the end of the day. You're taking something that might start as an executive vision or again, a small idea in that initiation phase, and you're turning it into ground level tasks for your team. And then you're also translating technical progress back up to leadership or maybe to other stakeholders in terms that they can relate to and in terms that they care about. So those two are very different conversations, and you have to be able to be fluent in both, or really all methods of communications with the stakeholders on your project. Second thing great PMs do is they influence. So most people whose performance you depend on are not going to be your direct reports. You might not have any formal authority over them in terms of an org chart structure or a management structure, but you obviously have a vested interest in their quality of work, their morale, their follow through. And so getting results through influence rather than authority is absolutely a core PM skill, and it takes real intentionality and time to develop. Third one a great PM does, they sense risks. So to me, this boils down to pattern recognition. It's knowing what a struggling project looks like a couple of weeks before it falls apart. Maybe it's the slightly evasive update from someone in your weekly call that tells you something's wrong. And this is another muscle you can develop over time, but you can accelerate it by, I think, being intensely curious, asking questions, and just paying close attention. The next one, balancing trade-offs. So again, every project will run into the triple constraint or iron triangle of scope, time, and cost at some point. And there will be moments where something has to give, right? And the art is knowing which one to sacrifice in a given moment, and making sure you get stakeholder alignment on that decision before it becomes a problem. The last one here, leading people. Projects do not deliver themselves. People deliver projects, right? So motivating a team, being able to mediate conflict, and also maintaining energy and morale through some of those hard stretches of a project is just as important as any work product, like a Gantt chart, a schedule, a budget analysis, what have you, that a PM is going to be responsible for. So we've covered some of the frameworks here, but now let's get into the part of the job that doesn't have a framework. This is where I feel like the textbook ends and the real work begins. So the PMBOK tells us, in its own words, identify and manage stakeholders. Great. What does that actually look like in practice? The reality there is that stakeholders rarely have simple stated needs. You're navigating conflicting agendas, hidden priorities, sometimes organizational politics, and again, people who communicate completely differently from one another. So anyone who's managed a project with a utility or a developer, even internally, maybe with your own team, should be able to relate to what I'm talking about. So here's how you can translate that into some different tactics. The first one is identifying your true client. So not just who's on an org chart, but who on a team or within a group of stakeholders has the power to define success or failure on this project. That's not always going to be the person signing a contract, and sometimes that can even change as your project is progressing. Whose needs do I need to serve in this phase or in this moment in this project? So that's a great question to be asking yourself. The second one related to that is mapping influence. So knowing who influences who, either people or different entities. If there are any coalitions or subgroups within that project team, understanding that informal decision structure very often ends up being more useful than the formal one as your project progresses. And then the third one, building rapport before you need something. I think the great PMs are the ones who can make that difficult phone call and get a real answer or a transparent response. And those are the ones who have very often invested in their relationship with their team members before a crisis hits. And they've established an environment where people can be transparent with one another. And then the fourth one here, I think goes without saying, but over communicate. Right? Stakeholders who feel uninformed very often are going to fill that vacuum with their own assumptions. And my rule of thumb is always those assumptions are almost never in your favor. So over communicate. Risk management sort of follows the same pattern, right? Again, the PMBOK tells you design a probability and impact matrix, assign likelihood, assign severity, build a risk register. Cool. That's the science. That's all really valuable. But in reality, again, the risks that actually derail projects aren't usually the ones tucked away on your risk register. They're the ones you felt coming before you could articulate them. You know, back to the smoke before the fire analogy, right? That might be a contractor who's been slightly too quiet for the last week or two, or maybe another contact on the utility side who all of a sudden out of nowhere stopped being responsive, or a milestone that is technically on track, but maybe all the activities leading up to you achieving that milestone feel fragile or maybe a little bit off kilter. And all of that, I think, boils down to pattern recognition. That's something you develop by paying close attention and staying curious over time. The other piece, and again, I think this is another one that separates good PMs from great ones, is knowing when to escalate versus when to shield. You know, not every risk needs to go to a leadership team immediately or all the way up the chain with a client. Some risks are yours as a PM to manage and resolve without creating unnecessary fire drills. But on the flip side, right, some risks do need to go up the chain immediately. And if you wait on those, that can have a big impact on your reputation. So developing that judgment and being able to know the difference between those is a big part of the art of project management. So a lot of what we've talked about in terms of art of project management really does come back to one thing that's already been mentioned here, and that is communication. It is genuinely a PM superpower. You know, things like status updates and regular report outs, when done well, those create clarity. Your stakeholder is going to know where your project stands, what's currently at risk, what's coming next. And that clarity is ultimately what's going to prevent, you know, a late night panic email, and certainly prevents just a lot of the uncertainty in general, right? Next one here too, one-on-ones and informal conversations are going to build trust. So not just with your team, but with your clients, with other stakeholders. And so the relationship that you're able to build with those folks in the quieter moments on a project are ultimately what you're going to be able to draw on when things do get hard and you need to have those difficult conversations. And next, your updates to management, those can build influence, right? How you frame project health, the risks, and the decisions you're making, those can shape how leadership perceives you and your project. And you know, that's not necessarily spinning something to achieve a certain outcome. That's just strategic communication. And underneath all of that, right, tailor your message to your audience. Again, be a translator. We mentioned that's what separates great PMs from good PMs. What a developer needs to hear might be different from what a utility engineer needs to hear, which is probably completely different than what your CEO needs to hear. It's the same information, packaged differently, intended to land differently. I'll pause there for a moment and see if anyone's got any questions so far on any of the material we've covered. All right. Not seeing any in the chat yet so far, but again, folks, if something does come up, feel free to drop it in there, and then I'll pause and we can chat about it. Next, I want to talk about something that I think gets said a lot, right? But I don't always see this applied in the way that I think it's intended to be. And that's the difference between managing a project and leading a project. And again, I'll be direct in our industry where you're constantly working with people who don't report to you. Again, whether that's utility folks, developers, contractors, regulators, balancing authorities, formal authority on your org chart can feel almost useless at times, right? Your org chart doesn't mean anything to a utility interconnection stakeholder who's got 12 other priorities. So what works in those scenarios is influence. And I believe influence comes from leadership, not from management. So yes, as I have here on the slide, great PMs can do both of those things. But my call to you guys is if you're only going to develop one muscle, make it leadership. The management skills are easier to learn. We've got a textbook for that defines within the PMBOK how to do that from a theoretical perspective. But the leadership skills, as most of you probably know, are much harder and much rarer, and they take more time to develop. And that's exactly why they're worth more. So we've talked about the conceptual differences between the science and the art. Now let's get into a few of the specific tools I mentioned and some of those techniques that actually translate those concepts into practice. So I want to highlight 4 today. Again, we'll go deeper into some of these in the next few slides, but this is the preview here. So first, the work breakdown structure, again, not just used as a paperwork exercise, but more as a genuine thinking tool. And the question is really asking is, what has to happen in what order before this task can be completed? Second one I'll touch on is RACI matrices, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. This is a super simple framework that eliminates an enormous amount of confusion on who owns what on a project. Third one we'll touch on is Agile frameworks. We'll talk about how some of the iterative principles from Agile translate well even into non-software project environments, which is what Agile was initially intended for. And fourth one here is storytelling with data. Data without a narrative can often just end up being noise, right? So the ability to take project metrics and data to build a coherent story for your stakeholders and for your team, I feel like is another genuinely underrated PM skill. So let's go deeper into each of these. So the work breakdown structure is exactly what it sounds like. You take the total scope of a project and break it down hierarchically into smaller and smaller pieces until you have something concrete and assignable at the very bottom. Move my mouse here. At the top, you've got your project, right? Below that, your major tasks or phases, or maybe even different milestones. Below those, you have subtasks. And at the bottom, you have actual work packages. And so these are the individual units of work on a project that someone can actually pick up and execute. And this is really, this is the building block of any complex schedule. You can't really build a credible timeline for a project without first understanding what all of the work actually is in order to then be able to sequence it, right? So this work breakdown structure is what forces that discipline. So in my own Kaiso new resource implementation projects, this is something I try to do instinctively, which is breaking deliverables into more digestible pieces so that our clients can stay focused and don't get overwhelmed by the full complexity of the process all at once. And this is something the process inherently tries to do it well, but we like to take that a step further. And the thought there is, you're not hiding anything by doing that. What you're instead doing is sequencing that information strategically so that, again, people can absorb it. They can stay focused on the next in line high priority tasks and act on them. So I would say if you take nothing else from this section or this concept, it's really learn to build a work breakdown structure before you build a schedule. This really is your policy document, right? If you skip it and something breaks, and as we all know, something always breaks, you have no paper trail there. So super important concept, and I think it really is worth thinking about in your project management. The next one here, RACI matrix. It again is I feel like this is one of the simplest and most underused tools in project management, especially on projects that are super complex and have multiple stakeholders. And it's really intended to answer one question that again can cause an enormous amount of confusion on projects. And that question is, who is responsible for what? And I'll share a quick story real quick about what happens without one of these. I had a project last year on the border of 2 utility service territories. We were deep in the execution phase of our project before anyone asked one simple question, which was, who's metering the station service at this site? The drawings we had from the engineer of record pointed to one utility. That utility pointed back to the developer and said, not us. The developer then pointed back to the other utility, who then said, it's not us either. Nobody owned it. And that single gap cost the project about 6 months of delays. And not because the work itself was hard, getting that meter set up and implementing that into the design was not difficult, but it was because nobody had properly confirmed or documented that ownership up front. And something as simple as a RACI matrix built during the planning of that project very likely would have forced that conversation super early instead of the tail end of construction, because all 3 of those parties, so the developers and both utilities, needed to be in that conversation. And that's the difference there. So RACI stands for 4 roles, right? Responsible, that's going to be the person, the people, the entity actually doing the work or completing a specific task. Accountable, that's the single person or entity with final sign-off authority. There can only be one, and if everyone is accountable, no one is, right? So super important to identify who's actually accountable for something versus who's responsible for it. Third one, consulted. So this will be someone like your subject matter expert who you may need input from, you may need more technical feedback from, and you're working with them before or during a task in order to seek their guidance. And then the last one is informed. So this is any stakeholder who needs to stay in the loop, but maybe is not actively contributing in any way to a work product or a specific task. And so again, for large projects with multiple stakeholders and work streams, the RACI matrix really prevents 2, I think, of the most common failure modes, right? The first one is tasks falling through the cracks because everyone assumes someone else owned them. And the second one is decisions getting stuck somewhere because the accountability wasn't defined clearly up front. So my recommendation here with this one is build this during your planning phase, right? Review it with your team, get all of your stakeholders aligned and on the same page with having the same understanding of this breakdown on your particular project, because it'll save you significant headaches in execution, and it'll help your team communicate better. because they know just as well as you what this looks like. So next we'll touch on Agile here. So again, Agile is worth understanding, even if your projects are not software development. So this originated in tech as a way to streamline software development, but I feel like the underlying principles of Agile translate surprisingly well to complex multi-stakeholder environments like ours. So at its core, Agile is built around three different ideas. The first one is iterative and incremental delivery. So rather than planning everything up front and executing it in one long arc, you're breaking the work into smaller chunks, often referred to as sprints, and delivering something at the end of each one of those sprints, then adjusting as you go. So conceptually, I mean, this is something you could probably do with a commissioning plan or a schedule for a large project. Second one here, continuous feedback. So after each iteration or sprint, you stop, you gather input, and you incorporate lessons learned before you move forward. And I think this is something great PMs do instinctively, regardless of methodology, but Agile formalizes it as part of its framework. The third framework or concept is flexibility and adaptability. Agile treats change as expected rather than as a problem. And so again, in our industry, with all of the dynamic regulatory requirement shifts in utility timelines, and even stakeholder needs changing constantly, this mindset is genuinely useful, even if you're not running formal sprints. And I think it's something that, again, a great PM is inherently doing is, making sure they are adaptable and dynamic in the environment. So last tool here I wanted to highlight is storytelling. And I mean that more as an actual tactical PM skill, not just as a soft concept. So if we look at the 5 applications on this slide, these aren't really abstract. These are real situations that you'll probably encounter on every project at some point. First one is stakeholder management. So when something like a milestone slips or an issue surfaces, how you frame that story as a PM determines whether your stakeholder panics or stays aligned with you. In my mind, facts without context can create anxiety or not paint a full picture, right? So a clear narrative can create confidence for you and confidence for your other team members. Next one is conflict management. So 2 parties, opposing positions or even differing positions, the PM who can reframe that conversation around a shared objective and then tell that story convincingly is the one who's going to get a win-win. And in my mind, the one who just presents the data might just get a stalemate. The next one is decision making. So stakeholders don't just need to know what a decision is, they should understand why it matters to them. And that why is always going to be a story. Next one, power and influence. So we talked previously about leading people you don't manage, right? Storytelling is how you can build that influence with them. People tend to follow PMs they feel connected to, and part of that connection can come through story. That's not going to come through your Gantt charts and your weekly status updates, right? That'll come through story. And then the last one here is managing uncertainty. So when a project hits a certain stage of ambiguity or uncertainty, your team and your stakeholders by default will typically fill that vacuum with their own narrative if they don't have another one to rely on. And so my thought there is make that narrative yours as the PM. But that also means make it a clear, transparent, and honest story about where things stand and what's being done about it. And I think that's one of the most stabilizing things a PM can offer in any situation like that. So we've covered a lot of the frameworks and different tools we can leverage. Now let's talk about where PMs can actually fail. So first one, too much process, not enough people. Process should be a framework, not a substitute for judgment and human connection as a PM. A PM who hides behind their tools and their templates and never invests in their team relationships is very likely going to consistently underperform the one who does do all of those things. And again, process should serve people, not the other way around. So that's common pitfall number one. Second one is scope creep. So sometimes yes is not going to be the right answer for a variety of different reasons. And being a supportive PM, both to your clients and to your internal team members, does not mean accommodating every request. You know, we talked about how every undocumented scope addition is sort of a silent attack on your schedule and your budget, right? And within that triple constraint, you have to know where to draw the line, and as the PM, be the one willing to draw it. And that's not just for the benefit of your project. That protects your client and your other stakeholders just as much as it protects you, because it keeps everyone focused on what the defined goal was. And the next one here, this is a phrase I've heard pretty often just in my own career, but everything is green until suddenly red. I think we've all seen this at some point. You know, a status report or you know, weekly meetings can look fine or feel fine week after week, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, project is in crisis, fire drills all over the board. And I think this can happen sometimes when PMs are optimistic reporters instead of honest ones. And so my takeaway there is escalate early, rip off the Band-Aid. A difficult conversation at week 4 in a project is always going to be better than a disaster at, say, week 12 or, you know, the most critical moments later in a project. I think, Kaylee, I saw you raised your hand and maybe took it down, but did want to pause and see if you had a question there.
Yeah, sorry. I was just going to add on to the point you made about scope creep. I think something that I've learned from Sarah Rhodes and from Doug is just because we say no doesn't mean we can't help them, which I think is an important distinction. Like, we don't want our SMEs to run themselves into the ground, but I think we can also offer an opportunity to help them without sacrificing ourselves. So for example, Sarah Rhodes, she's really good about saying, yeah, our SMEs don't have time for this, but here is a group that can help you. So I think you can still maintain those relationships while also maintaining our scope and our bandwidth.
Yeah, I would fully agree there. And I think another way to frame it, it might even be a yes, but you know, either not right now or yes, like you said, here's an alternative we can provide you in the meantime. So this is not intended to be a flat out no, but it is intended from a PM perspective to frame the thinking around what is our scope currently, where does this fall within that scope, and be able to make that evaluation. Again, to keep a project on track and to understand where the lines currently are, right? But yeah, definitely appreciate that addition there. I think we left off at everything green being green until suddenly red. The other one to consider, right, is going to be high performer burnout. You know, very often on teams, your best people are going to absorb whatever you give them until they don't. So very similar to everything being green until it's suddenly red, right? In a high performing team, this is something that can be a real risk management conversation. So I think the takeaway there is to watch your top performers closely, making sure you're distributing the load intentionally, and escalating any sort of resource constraints before someone or something breaks. Now let's bring it all together. So the PMBOK gives us structure, right? We've got our 5 process groups, we've got our 10 knowledge areas, we've got our different tools and different frameworks. That's the foundation, and it's genuinely valuable. We shouldn't be dismissing that, right? But real life does demand adaptability. It demands leadership. You know, your schedule is going to slip at some point. Stakeholders might surprise you, and risks you didn't necessarily anticipate are probably going to surface. So the science gets you ready for all of that, but the art is really what gets you through that. And again, the best PMs, what are they doing and how are they acting? I think there are 5 different things simultaneously that we've covered, right? The first one we talked about, they're translators. They're bridging those technical and non-technical worlds, or even you know, ground floor work resources to leadership. They're diplomats, right? They're navigating competing agendas with grace and with tact. They're risk radar detectors. They're sensing those problems before they become crises and using their pattern recognition skills to spot the smoke before the fire. They're motivators. They're keeping their teams energized through the hard stretches. They're building those relationships with all of their stakeholders and with their clients. And the last one, they're integrators. So they're making sure all the moving parts in all of those different knowledge areas and across all those stakeholders are working together seamlessly towards the same outcome. And so takeaway there, if you remember nothing else from today, this framework ideally should be your floor as a PM, not the ceiling. Before we get to Q&A here, I did want to leave everyone with a little challenge. So in your work after today, don't try to implement everything from today all at once if this is new to you, or if there were a couple of different concepts we explored today that maybe were the first time you're seeing them. My challenge to you is pick one PM habit, just one of the core concepts we talked about today, and commit to strengthening that over the next 30 days. So whether that's building a WBS before you touch a schedule, or even just being more intentional about your stakeholder communication, something like practicing honest status reporting instead of optimistic reporting, right? Choose one habit, give it a month, and see how it goes. And as you work through that, also start noticing where the science shows up in your work and where the art is required in your work. And again, I think this is super valuable because that awareness alone is, it'll make you a sharper PM if you're a PM in your functional role, or even just a project team member, right? These are all concepts that we can all employ in our day-to-day work, regardless of where we sit on a project. And I would wrap here just with saying too, if anything we covered today sparks a question later, or you want to keep the conversation going with me, I would love for you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I hear how you're applying this in your day-to-day. So feel free to reach out there as well. But I'm going to pop it over to one last slide here before we open it up for Q&A. I did just want to mention, I think all three of these are worth bookmarking. First one's PMI.org. If you're thinking about any sort of certification or want more resources to pursue the science of project management, right? I've got a link here for the PMI Sacramento Valley chapter. If you're local and want to get plugged into a local PM community, I'm an active member there, and it's a great network. But I would also say PMI has chapters in most major cities. So for those of you who are not local, you can find your city's local chapter from PMI.org.
Great. Thanks, Jacob, so much. Does anybody have any questions? Everybody should be unmuted, so hopefully they can unmute themselves and ask what they need to.
Hi, Jacob. Paolo Alvarado here. Just wanted to say great presentation. Really enjoyed sitting in on this. I wasn't going to join right off the bat because I'm not a project manager, but I realized that kind of we all are project managers. So I did have a question, but your last slide answered it. So I was looking for more resources around certifications and routes to to prep for certification. So I think that works. So now I'm just going to ask, is this slide deck shared, or are we just going to be able to view this on the YouTube channel?
Yeah, thanks, Paolo, and good to see you, by the way. Glad you were able to join. I think this is going to be shared on YouTube. I don't think the PowerPoint itself will be distributed, but obviously these links will be on the presentation for the last couple minutes. Is that right, Vivian?
Jacob, I'm sorry. I think something happened with my audio because I'm not hearing you at all, but let me check my speaker. I apologize. Okay.
Yeah, this will be available on YouTube in the next few days or so, where you'll be able to see these links in the presentation.
Okay, great. Sorry, I don't know what happened, but my audio went blank. I could see Jacob talking, but I couldn't hear him, and I did just hear the last speaker.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Paolo.
Do we have any other questions for Jacob before we wrap up? All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Like I said before, recording will be available on YouTube in the next few days. If you have any additional questions that do come up after the webinar, feel free to reach out to Jacob or to us, and we can answer any questions that you have. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all. Appreciate the time today.